What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Break Through the Silence. This is session 4, part 2 of the Betterman series that we've been going through. If you're new to this channel, really what this channel is all about is attempting to integrate psychology and spirituality as it relates to men's mental health. And the way that I'm attempting to do that primarily is just by pulling from my experience as a counselor, as well as talking about my own personal struggles in the past with mental health, and then also just talking about my own faith journey and what I've learned, whether that's theologically or just in the way that I connect with God. And so really just bringing that all together, and really in the most basic terms, you can probably think about this as just attempting to understand what it means to be a human being created in the image of God. And what we've been doing lately is we've been going through this course that I mentioned at the beginning, Betterman Core, and we are on session 4. This is talking about fatherhood and just kind of giving practical advice about how to approach being a father. And so in part 1 of this session, we talked about 3 different types of dads that they were identifying in the course. And so that was the problematic dad, the good dad, and then the smart, or as I like to think about it, the intentional dad. And this intentional dad is one who seeks out resources necessary to understand what he needs to provide to his children. And then secondly, he creates a specific plan to incorporate all that as his children go about developing. And then finally is number 3 is just that he commits to following through with that plan. So that was really most of what we covered in the first session, or the first part of this session. If you haven't seen it, feel free to go back. It is the most recent video posted on this channel. But anyway, we're going to be getting into the second part here. And so part 2 is really divided into 2 separate sections where he talks about, firstly, fathers. He's giving practical advice for fathers who feel disconnected from their kids, maybe have just, burnt bridges or feel like they've burnt bridges in the past based on past mistakes they made or just falling outs that they had with their children. So that's kind of the first one that he's going to talk about. And then secondly, he's going to be giving advice to sons who feel like they're still carrying around some kind of wound from their childhood, and how they can go about addressing that with their father. So really for this one, I'm gonna probably start following this format going forward. I think it just makes more sense to just go through the content. So I'm gonna recap the content, not really share too much about my own personal insights or thoughts on it. And then at the end, I'll kind of go back and share my main takeaways and expand on it a little bit. So anyway, getting into this next section about fathers who feel disconnected from their kids and maybe don't want to feel that way anymore. They would like to reconnect. Number 1, he says the most important thing to recognize is that it's never too late to seek reconciliation. I think it's easy to maybe fall into this trap of thinking like maybe it feels like a lost cause. And so he just wants to emphasize the point that it's never too late. Don't go about it with that mindset. Be willing to reach out and seek that reconciliation if that's something that you want for your life. And so number 2, though, is he says to be courageous and reach out to request a time to meet or call with your kids. And then within that meeting, he says to be sure to express love and genuine sorrow for the separation that they're experiencing. Number 2, be willing to admit that maybe you made some mistakes and acknowledge the way that has impacted them. And then explore ways to move forward. So that's kind of the structure that he says you should focus on with that meeting. And then number 3, he says, is to make sure you respect any resistance that might be present, right? So depending on the situation, your kids may have some kind of resistance to wanting to reconcile or wanting to even talk about anything that you guys have gone through. And so be willing to accept that and give them the time and space that they might need to come around and ultimately feel like they're ready to do that. And then section 4 is where he talks about the sons that are carrying wounds and gives advice to them about how they can go about approaching their father to reconcile. And so number 1 is that he says to start this process by seeking to understand his story, his father's story with his own dad. And then secondly, be honest about your wound, right? Don't hold back with the way that you feel like you have been wronged or the way that you have been hurt in the past. And he says that even, if necessary, this may include even just asking your father to affirm you in certain ways that maybe you never have gotten, right? Like if you feel like he's never expressed his love for you or expressed his appreciation for you, then be willing to ask for that. He talks about this conference he was speaking at where there were 700 men in attendance, and he asked anyone who has never heard that growing up, either, I love you or I'm proud of you or something along those lines, he asked everyone to stand up in the room. And he said that 650 men out of the 700 at this conference stood up. He said like he was expecting maybe 100 people would stand up. So to see 650 out of the 700 is pretty profound. So it's common, unfortunately, to not experience that from your father. Be willing to ask for that, is what he's saying. And then number 3 is to express forgiveness to your father and then release your pain to God. And then in addition to kind of these 3 main steps to take, he also just gives a few additional points to keep in mind as you're going about this process. And number 1, he says, is be the one to take the initiative. Just don't wait for your dad to come to you. Chances are that it's not going to happen, that if you feel like you've been hurt in your childhood, that you're likely to have to be the one to actually reach out and start that process, unfortunately. And then number 2, he says to reclaim the relationship that you feel like you missed out on in your childhood by becoming the father who is intentional with his kids, right? Like in part 1, we talked about this smart dad. I recapped at the beginning, the intentional dad. So seek to be that, strive to be that for your kids. And he says that this may even be something that your dad will pick up on and see the way that you're loving your children, and maybe that could lead him to want to change as well. And so finally, getting into my own personal takeaways, I think for me with section 3, talking about the fathers who feel disconnected from their kids and want to reconcile, essentially what I got from this is that you should make sure to approach it with this posture of humility, be willing to receive criticism, admit your own faults and mistakes that maybe you have made in the past that led to this kind of falling out between the two of you. And then also just being intentional about how to move forward. Like we talked about in part 1 of this session, this is just kind of the theme, I think, of this session in general is intentionality. And so be intentional about how you're going to move forward, whether that's creating the plan that we discussed, or depending on the age of your child at the time, that may not be feasible. So in that case, just be intentional about scheduling a time every week to either meet up with them or just get on the phone with them and really do what you need to do to continue to nurture that relationship. And then, so section 4, what I got mainly from this one is just the fact that you should start the process by approaching it with empathy. Approaching it in this way will help to kind of reduce any resistance or defensiveness that maybe your dad will have about wanting to even have this conversation. It will also make him feel seen and understood. And that can really do a lot for just the dynamic of how that conversation is going to play out. If you're able to kind of ease into it with this posture of humility and just wanting to understand, what your dad went through with his dad, then this is really going to benefit the flow of the conversation going forward. And he makes a point in the video that a lot of these wounds are cyclical, right? So if you can understand maybe the dynamic that your dad experienced with his father, it might help you to see the origin of it and give some more grace to your dad to realize, like, oh, maybe it's not his fault that, he had gone through this. He didn't know any better. This is all he knew growing up. And so he ended up continuing that cycle, unfortunately. But yeah, it'll likely give you a better perspective on the situation. And then again, similar to like for the father approaching his kids to reconcile, just be honest. As the son coming to your father, be honest about how you feel like you've been wounded and what you missed out on in your childhood, and clearly communicate that to him, right? Like clearly communicate what you feel like maybe you had a difficult time coming to terms with or accepting about yourself as an adult because of the things you experienced in your childhood. I think that it can be really difficult to be honest and straightforward with him about that. But ultimately, this is what I took from going through this section, is that you just got to be real. You got to be real if you really want to reconcile this. You just got to lay it all out there on the table. And then finally, the last takeaway I got was to be willing to ask for affirmations. I think when I first heard this, it sounded a little silly to be like, especially if you're, 30 years old like me. If it were me going to my dad, I would feel a little silly, like, Dad, can you affirm me? Can you tell me that you love me or that you're proud of me or whatever? But if that's something that you really were lacking in your childhood, the more I thought about it, I think that can be really powerful, especially in light of, I thought about Proverbs 18:21, which says, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruits. So just recognizing that our words have so much power and weight to build people up. I think asking that from your dad, if that's something that you feel like you need, is completely valid. It's completely reasonable to do that, and hopefully that'll help with that healing process. So anyway, that's the end of this session. Next week, we're going to be moving into session 5, which is titled Defining Manhood. And so this seems to be now they're going to really dig into actually creating this blueprint for what it means to be a man in today's culture, which is kind of the purpose of this course as a whole. So I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you guys for watching. If you found this valuable, I would really appreciate just liking and subscribing, maybe even sharing it with a friend if you feel like there's someone that could really benefit from this. But either way, thank you guys for checking it out, and I will see you next week. Peace.